can India meet its net zero target of 2070? And I will demonstrate that, yes, it can, it is possible, and there are certain technologies that will make it possible. And then I'll pass on the baton to Veena about what we can do in the short term to fast track it. So let me just talk about the challenge that India is facing. What India is facing, and all the eyes of the world are looking at India. Historically, India has not been a big emitter of global greenhouse gases. Only 3% of the cumulative emissions globally so far has been contributed by India. India's energy consumption is 1/10 of most of the Western countries and 40% of the world's average. It has to grow if its people have to have the quality of life they deserve. Now, India has to do it at a time when the growth has to be responsible. Because if India follows even halfway the path that the Western economies followed, or even China followed, the world, forget about 1.5 or 2 degrees. We don't have a hope of being anywhere close to 3 degrees Celsius. And this means that India has to lead the way. Now, if we look at India, it has some special challenges. First of all, it is energy poor. The challenge that is foremost for India is energy security. It spends close to $160 billion a year on energy imports. It's a debilitating yoke on the Indian economy. The second bigger problem is air quality in urban areas and cities, from diesel emissions, from our stationary generators that every Indian household or multiple households have when the power goes away. That is causing public health issues. And the third thing is India has to meet the greenhouse emissions target and become net zero by 2030. Its problem is it's not endowed with natural gas. It does not have uranium. It has some hydroelectric power generation, but any expansion requires ecological, monitoring, and it cannot be expanded as much as possible, although India is looking at pumped hydro in an important way. So coal remains a baseload power source for a decade or two as other technologies come in. India has demonstrated that it can reduce the cost of renewables and has shown one of the fastest track records in solar and wind that India is trying to progress on. The challenge is they don't happen all the time. So there are energy storage technologies that are needed. Now, this is where green hydrogen comes into the play. Green hydrogen is the next step for India, building on its renewable capability. The world has been using hydrogen for a long time. It's an industrial feedstock for the chemicals industry, for refining. We use it for vegetable oil generation. Everything we look at, we have been using hydrogen. It's not new. But the way it is produced from natural gas or from coal is highly emission intensive. Green hydrogen uses renewable electricity by electrolyzing water to produce green hydrogen. And its carbon footprint is almost non-existent, except the material that goes into electrolyzers, which of course Veena is trying to reduce. So green hydrogen is the first opportunity for India to actually look at energy independence in the long term. It's about the real independence as we talk about. Now, what are the challenges with green hydrogen? Well, right now, the cost of green hydrogen in the Western world is anywhere between $4 to $6 per kilogram. Now, it is expensive, but let me try to give you some examples to understand how expensive it is. If the price in Europe came to $2 a kilogram, natural gas is history, because at that point, it can replace in Europe at the European prices that it uses for natural gas. It will be able to replace natural gas. So we are talking about between $4 to $6 to $2. In the US, it'll take a bit lower because US is endowed with natural gas, and similarly the Middle East. Now, the other important thing to understand here is that if it came to $2 a kilogram, it becomes a transportation fuel because 1 kilogram of hydrogen is equivalent to 3 liters of gasoline. So you can do the calculation that the retail price we pay in India, already green hydrogen will be in the money at around $3 a kilogram. So that's understanding the economics. So how can we reduce the cost of green hydrogen? Well, there are at least 3 factors that affect. And the biggest factor of green hydrogen cost is the cost of renewable electricity. That's 70 to 75% of the cost of green hydrogen. Fortunately, India has been able to build renewable farms, solar farms at scale at one of the lowest cost points in the world. And what India is now doing is providing production-linked incentives to build solar farms, to build wind turbines, so the cost can come down further at Indian manufacturing costs. So that India has already mastered. The second is the cost of electrolyzers. Right now, European electrolyzers cost around $800 per kilowatt. Chinese cost around $300 to $400 per kilowatt. What India has decided, and most groups in India, including Adani, Reliance, and others, have decided that if India is going to have green hydrogen revolution, India will have to manufacture electrolyzers using Indian bill of materials at Indian labor cost because there is no rocket science in the technology. And India expects to bring down the cost of electrolyzers to under $200 by the end of this decade. So we are already 85 to 90% up there in terms of the reduction in the cost. And the third factor that is also important is the utilization factor of your capital expenditure in electrolyzers. So if you only have solar farms, then you are only utilizing your electrolyzers for 30% of the time. But if you also have wind turbines, wind farms, then your utilization factor goes up to 50%. The problem is the solar and wind do not happen at the same location. So you have to build transmission lines at low cost. So groups that have solar, wind, hybrid, transmission line building capability will be further able to bring down the cost of green hydrogen. And Mr. Gautam Adani's vision of hydrogen adjacency is because these are some of the core strengths of the Adani Group, including scaling up solar panel manufacturing to 10 gigawatts a year by 2030, and also wind turbine manufacturing and electrolyzer manufacturing. And fortunately, other business groups in India are also doing the same thing. And that means India will be able to bring down the cost of green hydrogen. And the equipment that it will produce will enable green hydrogen reduction, green hydrogen revolution in the rest of the world. So finally, why is green hydrogen important for net zero? It is the last mile in the decarbonization of almost any sector that you can imagine. Let me explain. As I said, thermal power is going to be part of the Indian equation for a while. Now, if you look at green hydrogen at a price point under $1 a kilogram, which India could achieve before 2040, or at 80 cents a kilogram, the combined cycle hydrogen turbines can produce baseload power that is equivalent to the top quartile of thermal power plants. So there is a pathway out of thermal power for India as the price of green hydrogen comes down. And I'm not saying that this is the only pathway, but there is at least one pathway. It could be that small modular nuclear reactors become so cheap that they could provide baseload power. So many things can happen in technology, and you should never assume that a path will happen. But what gives us hope is that there is a pathway. What do we do now in the meantime? In the meantime, we have to figure out how to reduce the emissions of our thermal power plant. And this is where we are learning from the Japanese. The Japanese have the same problem. Now, it turns out that ammonia can be co-fired with coal because their combustion points are very similar. So if you blend 20% ammonia with coal, then you reduce the emissions by 18 to 19% of the thermal power plants. And if you make that ammonia using green hydrogen rather than the hydrogen from natural gas, then that's green ammonia. And this is how, in the intermediate term, we want to reduce the emissions of the existing thermal power plant. And if you take the upstream emission of natural gas, then you will see that coal with these sort of enhancements will serve India well until the green hydrogen price comes down. Adani is also in natural gas distribution with Total. At $1 a kilogram, you can upgrade your natural gas pipelines to polyethylene, and you can replace it with green hydrogen. You, of course, have to get your burner tops changed too, but that will happen in time. Now, at $1 a kilogram of green hydrogen, it will be equivalent to $7 per MMBT of natural gas. India has never had so cheap natural gas except during COVID. Okay. Look at shipping. Shipping is a big challenge. And most likely the solution is going to be green ammonia produced from green hydrogen. Now, assuming that green ammonia internal combustion engines will not cost more than diesel because the volume will be there, at around $2.50 of green hydrogen, you actually can decarbonize from an operational perspective the shipping. Adani Group is also in airports, so we have to worry about the aviation footprint. So sustainable aviation fuel, the ultimate one is you capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, you combine that with green hydrogen, and then you make e-kerosene, which is the aviation fuel. But in the meantime, India has so much carbon dioxide, and the cost of direct air capture is very expensive right now. So let's look at cement. India's construction journey is only beginning. And the cement consumption will have to go by 5 to 10 times. It's very hard to decarbonize. So we can look in the future of taking carbon dioxide from cement plants, combining with green hydrogen, and then making long-lived polymers like PVC, which can be used in building materials, and they are equivalent to storing the carbon dioxide. And that will be important because India does not have sequestration reserve. So carbon capture and storage doesn't work for India unless someone is willing to take it and ship it to Houston or Middle East or Australia to pump it inside the ground. Similarly, steel has to go up. Now, steel is an economic opportunity for a country like India. India is endowed with iron ore because it was joined to the hip with Australia during the Gondwana days. And Western Australia and Eastern India have significant iron ore reserves. But what India does not have is coking coal. And that is the second ingredient in iron and steel. And this is where DRI technology becomes important using green hydrogen. And India can use its iron ore to use green hydrogen to produce sponge iron, which can go into electric arc furnaces, which by using renewable energy will produce green steel. So that's a path. Green hydrogen is the last mile for almost any sector that you look at. But I'm actually excited to hear about what Veena is doing even before DRI becomes cost effective. She's at the forefront of that technology. And we'll pick up some more in the question answer. But let me introduce Veena in a different way. Veena has made a name for herself in the circular economy, both ensuring that we use less materials by reusing and recycling waste products, and also how do we make materials that are low carbon footprint to begin with. And I believe that it had to be an Indian to scale these heights. When I was growing up, circular economy is in India's DNA. I remember my mom saving every dabba, which used to sort of go on for decades, used as storage for everything. Everything in India gets used. I think it's probably even deeply cultural. We think of reincarnation not for just humans and life form, but also we subscribe this to inanimate objects and materials. And it's something that really comes as second nature to people from India. And I'm very pleased that Veena has made a name for herself. And it'll be exciting to hear what we can do in the short term, how we can reduce the consumption of energy and materials to begin with. And then we will have some discussion and finds what are some common grounds. So Veena, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Arun, and thanks for sharing, the fantastic, I guess, insights into the world of green hydrogen, because I think that's so important that we all really get to understand that bigger picture and, connecting it not just about the generation, but ultimately using it in different sectors and showing that it is cost effective and economically viable and all the things that, of course, we have to worry about if we're going to bring technologies to life. So I'm sure we'll chat about that a bit later. But just as a quick high-level statement to me, when we're talking about manufacturing different kinds of materials and products, whether it is steel, whether it is ceramics and polymers, in all of these cases, of course, the work that needs to happen is recognition that when we talk about circularity and recycling and remanufacturing and all the things that you've absolutely hit the nail on the head there, that it is probably in the DNA of a lot of Indians growing up. You can't help yourself. For myself, the secret's there. I'm a hoarder inherently. I don't think any of the things that come out of my home just end up in a bin. They actually usually end up in my labs at UNSW, the Smart Center. And we're sort of going about exploring and starting and laying the foundation for exciting new research projects. So in fact, one of the things that we're working on at the moment with our micro factories is looking at how we might be able to take waste textiles and waste glass and using that as part of creating a whole new generation of green ceramics. And, I bring that as an example because it's got not only some of the challenges, as we know, that the world is facing with waste textiles as part of how do you actually look after recycling and circular economy and all of those important questions, but also on the other hand, the fact that we can produce high quality green ceramics. And I'll hold up an example of a green ceramic tile. I don't know if people can see that, but you can basically see all those fantastic colors, the blues and orange. All of that comes from waste textiles. Now, there's a whole lot of, science in there, that material science that allows us to create a product like that. But the reason why I make that point is what goes into this is waste glass as well as waste textiles. The ability to create a highly engineered product like that, which allows us to replace a lot of traditional, tiles that get used, means that you're effectively decarbonizing a sector that not only can take waste, but also taking all of that waste glass that traditionally, if you had to remelt glass and if you had to put it back into a smelter, you would need much higher temperatures. So bringing temperatures down in any manufacturing process, bringing recycling into the picture, but most importantly, creating high performance products like these green ceramics is an example that you look at what we're doing in Australia right now. A lot of that conversation around safety associated with engineered stone products because of the crystalline silica in those. So we do know that there are many, many challenges associated with traditional products. So why would we not look at alternatives, particularly if you can bring in more sustainable feedstock? And then, of course, what we're showing in Australia with these micro factories is that you can deploy them in any remote and regional community, take locally available within the surrounding regions available feedstock of waste glass and waste textiles. And you're therefore reducing transport distances because you don't have to bring products in from long distances. You can actually create these local micro factories. And I think the important other point is that the ability for local communities to be able to create those local jobs in their regions becomes important. And now you're in a position to say, I've created high quality products that then can go back into homes. And so when we talk about, creating more sustainable and affordable homes, we have to start to imagine all kinds of products that we need when it comes to sustainability. So these are just simple examples of what can be done when it comes to talking about decarbonization, but doing it in a way that there are solutions that can be practically deployed. And of course, our model very much with these microfactories is that we can deploy these microfactories anywhere in the world, wherever there's a stockpile of waste. So the fact that here we're working with an operator a few hours south of Sydney, that's because there is a stockpile already available. The local council is already collecting a lot of these waste resources. We've now got an opportunity to literally say that the microfactory is coming to you, rather than saying that the materials are going to a factory. We've turned that upside down and we said, well, you know what, if you've already got a pile of all this waste that is being collected, let the microfactory come to you. And that's exactly what we've done, deploying these microfactories close to where these waste resources are already available, allows us to then, of course, create those solutions. And not being too far away from Sydney also means that the market opportunities are right here. So again, you can imagine that if somebody in Sydney in a building and construction project, was looking to import some expensive stone or such products, whereas the option existed to procure these products from local operators, you've actually reduced transport mileage as well. And so, really thinking about that holistic nature of how you can lower the impact of waste that would have ended up in landfill, that would have, we know things like waste textiles end up, causing water pollution as well, because fibers, microfibers, microplastics, all of that will end up in our soil, in our waterways. So, it's also about showing that by seeing these as valuable resources, if that means that local economies can capture materials, can put them into manufacturing, you've taken these waste materials out of landfill. And of course, you've also shown that they're not just waste resources, as I was showing you earlier in those green ceramic tiles, they are actually value-added products that have been engineered to perform. So when you measure its properties and say, look, is it good enough for the application as floor tiles and different other applications? Is it mechanically fit for purpose? Of course, that's where the challenge is. Can we deliver the right properties, fit for purpose technologies, and products that, of course, allow us in a holistic way to achieve decarbonization, achieve sustainability goals, but also keep an eye on what humanity needs? If we're talking about affordable housing solutions, that's a great way to show that in a holistic manner, we can bring waste, remanufacture, put them back into various homes, and bring more sustainable products into the marketplace and make it affordable so that you can deploy these kinds of solutions anywhere in the world. So we can also lower the cost. We don't just see this as recycling. We should actually see this as remanufacturing and creating high quality products from waste, because I think that's sometimes, very counterintuitive. People assume that if you've got waste, that the product that you make is going to be substandard. And what we're really trying to say here is that it doesn't have to be that way. You need to know your raw materials, the feedstock, your manufacturing process, which is where our microfactories come in. And then ultimately, of course, really producing high performance products. So I've kind of talked about one particular example of green ceramics to just kind of shine a light on the multifaceted benefits that can come out of, the innovative transformation pathways to achieve our goals when it comes to sustainability, because of course it's got to be always around, the human-centric thinking. In all of this, the benefits for communities, if you've taken waste away from landfill, but you've also created products that are needed by people across the world. When you think about so many disadvantaged communities, the kinds of things people struggle with is, how do you actually have homes? How do you have products in your homes that are affordable? So enabling more sustainable and green manufacturing built off the back of waste resources that would have otherwise gone to landfill. I remember traveling in a suburb not too far from New Delhi, and people who might have had the chance to hear about this, called Selampur, and going there and really looking at how, at the grassroots level, to me, the people who are working there are really, they're champions, they're waste champions. Now imagine if you can equip these kinds of waste, resources and the people who are working there with micro factories, then of course you're enabling both from a monetization point of view, you're lifting up, of course, the ability of people to create those local jobs and jobs that will give them better wages, but also equally importantly, you're creating opportunities for potentially innovative products that can be deployed in many communities. So I guess that kind of holistic thinking is an exciting way to think about potentially what the future could hold. And of course, the essential thing in all of this is where you've hit the nail on the head is, what about that energy security question? How are we going to get there? By bringing costs down and showing how renewable energy can play a role in producing green hydrogen and enabling us to all see the opportunities at an affordable price becomes such a win-win outcome from a sustainability point of view, both from energy, as you've clearly articulated, and of course, from materials and products point of view, we can achieve sustainability in a holistic way for our communities, no matter where you are in the world.
So Veena, let me pick this up a bit further.
Yeah.
I think sustainability, recycling, circular economy, as you said, people in India are champions. But I think what is needed is, can the scientific community do enough work to ensure that new business models can emerge?
Yeah.
So let me just say that already people are collecting this information, and sometimes they use that material that they have collected for low economic value.
Yeah.
Now, if there was enough information, so let me just talk 3 points, and I want you to reflect on that. One was that if for every household object or things that people use in day-to-day life, there were pathways for higher economic value, and what is the local economic context where they can be bought. So you educate both the buyers and the sellers to actually create a new business model around it. In an extreme setting, if you take this, there's the concept of urban mining, especially for areas like copper. If you keep mining more and more copper, it's not only energy intensive and probably not good for the planet, but there is so much copper recycling that can happen. And urban mining is the concept of actually just taking used things, like in electric arc furnaces, you take the scrap. Now, if the problem is these things are not sort of formalized to the extent they can be. We all know in India, every small sort of little town has kabadi walas. Okay. If there was some work done to create a network of all these kabadi walas, where they became platforms of supplying, to electric arc furnaces or to copper smelters, then what happens is there is a greater economic value, almost creating the Amazon or of this waste product for higher value added. And the third thing that becomes important in this area is, for a business model to survive, we need trust. How do we know that this actually is a waste product? How do we know? Because once you start using waste product, there will be regulatory incentives to allow you to charge premium prices, because people want to be able to use it in their upstream emission calculations and show that they're being responsible. But if you start doing that, then how do we create a technology base, a trust architecture, perhaps using blockchain, that builds the trust so that anything made from recycling actually can charge a premium as input material to the other sort of products, because that's how the business model will be created. So I just wanted to reflect on all this.
Look, Arun, you've really asked a very important question. All of this, when we talk about how all this is going to become, ultimately economic viability. And of course, the kinds of things that we have shown as an example of our green steel, if I may sort of pivot to that in a moment, because it's a great way to kind of, I guess, answer the question you're talking about, that transparency in the supply chain, and to be able to show that, yep, indeed, exactly when we talk about provenance of materials, where is it coming from? So we need to be able to have that underpinning system so that you can then say, right, okay, I know I can buy those waste resources. I can then show that it is headed towards an ethical way to be able to produce these kinds of important materials, whether they're metals or ceramics or whatever the case might be. So in our case with green steel, of course, the ability to take waste tires and inject that as part of the electric furnace steelmaking process to liberate hydrogen from those tires in steelmaking means that we've got to be able to show that how are these tires collected, how were they processed, and our industry partner, of course, in Australia, has also acquired infrastructure and assets that allow them to process those waste resources. And then the supply chain is very clear that that's really where the materials are coming from. This is how much coal we have replaced in the process of making steel. And of course, as a result of that, to your point, if we're going to talk about reduction in emissions, then we all need to, in a very transparent way, understand, well, how did that come about? So we need to understand all of these elements of how these waste resources, that if they are used in the process of manufacturing, how are they going to actually reduce our energy consumption? And of course, when we bring in more and more recycled materials, we automatically are reducing our carbon footprint, because a lot of these materials have already got that embodied energy that went into making it in the first place. So, recycled copper, when that gets put back into remanufacturing, or steel, or any of these materials, the amount of energy that you need is lower than if you had to process ore that then goes into making that particular metal. So absolutely, that science is pretty clear that there are, of course, benefits in terms of reducing our carbon footprint. So it also will encourage people, if they know that it's not only good for the environment, but there are manufacturers who want more sustainable feedstock. So if you want to be able to be in the business of kind of buying and selling these kinds of materials and creating these supply chains, then of course you need to be able to have that complete transparency in your supply chains, and where is it coming from and who's buying it. So, you can't just say, well, I've recycled my materials, so I'm good. You need to be able to show that whoever bought it from you has also put that back into remanufacturing. So knowing that entire life cycle of a material and the transformation of it becoming another product is absolutely important. And so to your point, a lot of that, knowledge that is needed, that then gets captured through, of course, various systems, I think is going to be, as important, because we need to capture that information. And of course, then when you get to that point in your journey where you want to access more and more sustainable feedstock, that you can jump on an online website or a system, a marketplace, let's say. So in Australia, we've got Planet Arc that runs the Australian circular economy. It's basically the ACE hub that allows people to, see what Planet Arc is doing. And these are the kinds of things we need, and of course, it's got to be done within a given country or within a given region, because you're not going to be buying and selling a whole range of materials from long distances when something's locally available. So that's the other thing, knowing what's locally available and knowing quality of that feedstock is going to be critical, so that you've got, to your point, you've got trust in what you are buying and sourcing as well. And yeah, we absolutely need to challenge ourselves in redefining those business models.
Well, thank you so much. Arun, were you going to say something? I don't want to interrupt.
No. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, no, thank you
Keep
so
talking.
much. Yeah, I was just about to say, I think we could listen to both of you, I think, for hours, and just, you're regaling us with so much knowledge and great information. And, thank you from the bottom of our hearts for taking the time, educating us on such an important issue. Thank you. And in the interest of time, I think we'll not take any audience questions for this panel because we do need to move on. But once again, Arun and Veena, we're so grateful to both of you. I want to move on to the next panel that's coming up, which is hosted by GIVE. GIVE, as many of you know, is Indiaspora strategic alliance to amplify philanthropic giving from institutions, foundations, and high net worth individuals from the United States to social impact initiatives in India. So let me turn it over to Ashish, who is the CEO of GIVE North America. Ashish, take it over.
Thanks, Amita. Delighted to be here, and a very big thanks to Indiaspora for inviting GIVE to host this panel. So, as the conversations throughout the day have demonstrated, it is clear that climate change is undeniably the defining issue of our time and requires collaborative and urgent action from all sectors, whether it's the corporates, civil society, governments, the social sector, and philanthropy. When it comes to philanthropic giving, while climate-focused philanthropy has increased over the last several years, a recent study by the Aspen Institute found that less than 2% of global philanthropy is focused on climate-related giving. The same trend is observable in Indian philanthropy as well. While giving to climate has increased in recent years, the total giving to climate is still a small fraction of India's total giving. Given the important role that India plays in the world's response against climate change, and I think the key role that philanthropy also can potentially play as a driver of climate action work, our panel today on the state of climate philanthropy in India will provide important insights into this topic from several different perspectives. This discussion is also personally important to us at GIVE, because in the coming weeks, we will be launching a fund to scale existing climate action work in India and to pilot new projects and programs as part of our commitment to the fight against climate change. With that, let me very briefly introduce our panel. We are very lucky today to have 4 leading climate experts on our panel who, through their leadership and at their respective organizations, are playing a vital role in catalyzing climate action in India. Shloka Nath is the CEO of the India Climate Collaborative, an organization focused on collective action and bringing together stakeholders across disciplines to accelerate climate action in India. Anita Arjun Das is the executive director at A-Tree, an organization that has for the past 2 decades worked on creating interdisciplinary knowledge to inform policy and practice towards conservation and sustainability. Samir Sisodia is the CEO of Rain Matter Foundation, an organization that supports ideas, projects, and other organizations focused on climate action, the environment, and livelihoods associated with them. And finally, Gaurav Gupta who is the global managing partner at Dalberg Advisors, a leading advisory firm focused on enhancing the social impact of companies, governments, and NGOs. He also leads Dalberg's climate and energy practices. Gaurav has agreed to moderate this panel and drive the conversation forward. So welcome all, and Gaurav, over to you.
Ashish, thanks for the kind invite, and hi everybody. I'm going to launch right into it because we don't have that much time, and I'd love to make some space for questions from you. So I guess to start off with, why is this topic important? Because if you look at philanthropic capital, at best, philanthropic capital around the world has been estimated to be about $1.5 trillion. Now, contrast that with the fact that BlackRock by itself is managing over $10 trillion of assets under management. So we're talking about something that is a drop in the ocean relative to the tens of hundreds of trillions of dollars that's needed for the transition for climate change. And you just heard about this. And yet at the same time, philanthropic capital is extremely powerful. It's the most nimble. It's the one that can take the most risk. It is the thing that goes forward where others fear to tread, whether it's governments who want to be too conservative or private capital that doesn't want to take the risk, or because there are stakeholders that people think, well, can't serve them, right? They're not. There's not a market, or they're not politically important enough. Philanthropic capital plays such an important role in catalyzing us to do better. And in climate, we're in a very moving space where we need to bring that kind of leadership and innovation. So philanthropic capital plays a really critical role of taking some of the first steps and actually catalyzing a whole bunch of other capital. It has done that in that many, many times. It's also done that in climate. A great example is energy access. A big part of thinking about addressing climate is the energy transition at a time where there's actually a few billion people who are not getting enough energy. Forget transition, they need to transition to energy. And philanthropic capital has played such an important role over the last 10 years in making sure that those first steps are actually green. So there are many, many examples where this kind of capital can set the tone. And so I'm really delighted to have Anita, Shloka, and Samir for this panel to really help us understand what's that specific role it can play in India. And as a way of setting the scene, there's no one better than Shloka to talk a little bit about, Shloka, tell us a little bit about what's happening in India on climate philanthropy, but specifically what's different about it. Climate philanthropy is, as you know, there's not enough being invested globally. So I know that's a general trend, but what's specific about India? What makes it different from the kind of philanthropy you've seen elsewhere? Over to you.
Thanks, Gaurav. And thank you so much for sort of setting the context around why philanthropic capital is so valuable. I always feel like we end up sort of starting most of these panels, and I think everyone, the panelists here today will agree as well. We always end up sort of having to almost prove our positions, in philanthropy, specifically within the climate sector as to why it's sort of so catalytic, compared to, of course, the scale of public and private finance. So thank you for doing that. And thank you to the Indiaspora team for inviting me here today. It's actually a really critical topic, and we're sort of incredibly excited to talk about this with such a diverse and I think incredibly important audience for philanthropy in India, specifically around climate. So with that, Gaurav, to your question, look, I think where we are here in India today is that we definitely have seen domestic climate philanthropic ambition grow stronger over the last few years. Samir can really speak to this because he's one of the sort of recent entrants into the space. Rain Matter Foundation is a critical player. And they're a very good example of some of the sort of developments or how the domestic climate philanthropic space is evolving with foundations like his who are committed to the cause. You have, ADK Foundation is another really good example. They're launching the Grow for Climate Fund, which is a really catalytic fund looking at sort of institutional funding for CSOs in this space. And so across the board, there's a rising impetus from philanthropic leadership around, climate action being a core component of how India should develop. And I think that's a very important and positive development, of course. But I think what's important to point out also is that our climate finance needs are actually outpacing our philanthropic commitments. So if you look at the total number in terms of, India alone requires like 2.5 trillion USD till 2030 to meet our national development commitments. That's a very, very sort of big number. And if you look at, tracked green finance in India right now, it actually accounts for less than 25% of the amount that's required to meet the NDCs. And if you look at tracked adaptation finance, it's even lower. It's significantly below our needs, and it's not even tracked that well. So if you think about finance as a critical lever, philanthropic capital playing a really important role in that, it's well below where we should be. And climate philanthropy in India is insufficient today, and a lot more needs to be done. We know that less than 2% of global philanthropic giving is dedicated to climate change mitigation specifically. This is a very widely quoted statistic from Climate Works Foundation. And I think it served as an important rallying cry for increasing philanthropic ambition globally. But we have really a lack of an analogous India-specific figure. And I think that just serves to highlight the lack of focus on the sector domestically. One that is increasing, as I said, but isn't yet where it needs to be. But I'll pause here. There's a lot more to say, but I think that just sort of brings it into perspective for this conversation.
No, thank you. And you raised an important point about just actually the lack of information. In some ways, part of catalyzing other capital. I mean, capital flows, follows evidence in many ways. And so I want to turn it to Anita, because in some ways, the question is, do we have the kind of research base in India? Because philanthropic capital has been very good in the past. If you look at especially health research, even what happened as part of the pandemic, to take on those important research and data gaps that then allow, governments to act, that allow private sector to act. Do we have a strong base within India right now to think about all of those, both directly climate and intersectional with climate issues? And I know Atri works a lot on that. So perhaps, Anita, you can give us a sense of, is there enough being done and where are the main gaps? So you're on mute.
Yeah, thanks for that, Gaurav. I think maybe where I like to start first is really look at when we talk about climate philanthropy, and particularly in the Indian context, data is absent, yes, in terms of the total giving, but from what is available, we're just looking at about last year's data based on the It'll Give Urine report of about 200 crores that was allocated for environment and sustainability related giving. And, climate is a subset of that. And then within climate, when you look at mitigation, which tends to get much of the funding, largely around clean energy, you actually have nothing happening towards climate adaptation and even less towards climate resilience. So I thought it was important first to look at all of the three aspects and not kind of, only focus on philanthropy for mitigation and mitigation, which is focused on energy, because, for example, Maitri's context, a lot of our work is around nature-based solutions. And all of us know that at least 30% of the carbon problem can be addressed through natural solutions. So how do you also look at giving encompassing adaptation and disaster preparedness, resilience related issues on one side? On the other side, look at issues of natural capital. And finally, on the third side, actually looking at just transition pathways for communities that would be most impacted. We often look at giving and sometimes in a siloed manner, but to me, biodiversity loss, climate change, and the whole issue of human well-being are extremely interconnected. You just can't separate the three. And so even when you're looking at giving, looking at solutions, looking at problems that are being examined from all of these three lenses are extremely critical. To your specific question about are there organizations doing enough research and being supported adequately, I think there is some good work happening across the country in terms of research in the space. The issue really is that much of that research gets converted into pilots and proof of concepts. Not a lot of it goes towards being able to be scaled up. The organizations that do the research well are not necessarily the organizations that should be looking at the scale dimension. So what we need is a good partnership and collaboration of implementation organizations, scale players, and the knowledge generators to be able to work together to address these issues.
So you spoke about essentially we need people who scale. So I'm going to bring Samir in on this, because I think Rainmatter Foundation is really, with respect to the amount of commitment and focus on climate, one of those organizations that can take some of the smaller ideas to scale, and then hopefully have potential either private or government capital also come in. So Samir, maybe you can speak a little bit more about firstly the thinking on the foundation itself, because it is one of the first ones to make such a large commitment. And I think it'd be great for the audience to hear a bit about it. And then maybe address Anita's question on what is that pathway to scale? I mean, are you one of the steps? Are there other folks that you think that there is a pipeline that takes good ideas to scale on climate in India, or is that sorely lacking?
Thanks, Gaurav. This is an important discussion. I think there are other folks. I mean, Atri has been doing this for 25 years. Shloka and team have been at it for years now, trying to move the needle on it. So I think it is everything everywhere all at once in the truest sense of the word. I'm glad you mentioned intersections, and Anita detailed that out with respect to biodiversity, and that's how we started looking at the climate problem. It's not just a problem of temperature and carbon. It's a problem of 350,000 different materials that we inject into the biosphere. It's the construct of our economy, the materials we use. It was fascinating to listen to Veena earlier about the attempts at circularity and the idea of taking the factory, the mini micro factories to people. I think that's absolutely the right direction. So when we started out, we of course 2 years ago we were struggling to understand the climate problem from the Indian perspective. Over a year, we spoke to a lot of people, traveled a lot, and understood how it might intersect with people's daily lives, with what they do out there in rural India, in the urban context, and so on and so forth. And it's where it was born, really, right? Like the bad trade-offs, the debt we accrued in each of our activities, each of the activities of human existence, is where climate change was born. And we are not going to fix it in a separate silo of just energy and mobility. Right? We actually need it fixed in everything. I mean, yes, the energy transition is important, but you cannot do it without addressing energy efficiency first, and the efficiency of our food systems, and the efficiency of our urban design, and the efficiency of everything we have designed and done. So I think philanthropic capital is catalytic, like you said, and the catalyzing we need right now is, I mean, we avoid using the word scale because it means a bunch of different things to a bunch of different people. So what we are using is mainstreaming. How do you get this to the mainstream rather than a little pilot here and a POC there? So yeah.
Maybe something, I'm going to push you a little bit more because I think it'd be interesting for the audience to get into a specific example. I know you've had a background in farming and you talked about food systems. Mm-hmm. Now, something that's not necessarily unique to India, but certainly representative of a lot of developing countries is the smallholder farmer. Mm-hmm. And I certainly don't see enough that talks about, and I mean, Anita also spoke about the fact that we're not talking about adaptation, right? You look at the smallholder farmer, which is a backbone of both employment and a big part of the GDP still in the country. In the next 10 years, that smallholder farmer has to totally transform with respect to climate change. So when you talk about intersectionality and how perhaps your foundation would work on that, let's use that as an example and build on it. Like, I'd love to know how you might think about that problem. And I'd love to hear from Anita, like, what are some of the missing pieces of research that, or information, or even policy, because I know your organization pushes policy, to see the kind of transformation that needs to be made. So Samir, perhaps starting with you, given your background in it, how does that farmer need to transform over the next 10 years? And where do you think philanthropy can play a role?
And the need for that was very obvious early on, because we are facing water stress. We are facing a massive loss of soil quality and topsoil itself. Food security will come from that, and heat and flood stress on food systems. The water usage in agriculture, in food production. I'm not even going to post harvesting and value addition. That represents 30% plus of any state's electricity budget, flat out. Right? When you add the other layers on it, it could be much higher. We don't actually have the numbers on it. It's not apportioned well. So if you're serious about solving the energy problem, you have to solve the irrigation problem. Right? You can't solve these in isolation. It's also smarter to do it because it's resilient. It's adaptation as well. So it's not just mitigation, but it's adaptation as well. Right? So these lines blur very easily when you start to take a systems lens to understanding this. It's also super smart to do it because it's local resilience as your supply chains stress and snap. It happened during COVID. It's happened during a bunch of floods and other disruptions we've seen in the last few years across India. It's great for biodiversity because today most places are pushing 2 or 3 commodities grown in a particular area. Right? As we expand that basket of production and matching your own basket of needs, it will lead to increased biodiversity or an increased need for biodiversity in a particular area. How you get this going is an interesting one. We have a few ideas. The economic trigger is the most first order, immediately visible one. And I hate to say it, but thankfully there's an opportunity there, because most of India has been losing out economically because of the procurement change today on a seasonal basis, on a running basis. Because like I said, they're producing 3 or 4 commodities, pushing them hard. And most of their own basket of needs comes on the back of a truck from outside their cluster and their bioregion, right? Which is an absurd situation, even for the basics sometimes. It's crazy how many villages in India are buying their vegetables from a town nearby, right? That's footprint. So if this is visible to folks, if the low-hanging fruits, the low-hanging possibilities are obvious and visible, if the solutioning around it is available to people in a mainstream way, in an ecosystem way, rather than coming through programmatic bundles, pre-decided in very narrow ways and for specific pilots, I think we could start to see a scale transformation there, right? The specific answers will vary a lot by region, by where you are in the country. But I think the approach to problem solving, this approach to problem solving could see dramatic change.
Yeah, it's a great summation of a complex issue. I mean, I'd add the 5th one, right, which is actually nutrition, because as you engage on that conversation, part of the issue with the carbon footprint is actually it's also just bad nutrition. The more local growing, you're getting a higher form of nutrition. And so, Anita, back to you, because if you're sitting there outside of India, right? We're in the Indiaspora forum here, right? And you're thinking about how to engage on this topic. I know many people have come from those sort of rural background. My own family has come from a rural background and moved to Australia a long time ago. I was unusual in coming back. Like, there's a strong desire to think about how to help, how to think about those communities. When you think about the things that Samir is talking about, is there, like, do we know how to engage? Do we know answers? Is there good decentralized levels of data that's been collected that's helping us think about what the future farmer needs to look like, what a lot of these supply chains need to look like? Is this a big area of potential investment for philanthropy?
So Gaurav, I think quality of data is always a concern. I would say where people have been working in landscapes for many, many years. For example, in A-Tree's case, it has 4 or 5 community-based conservation centers, as we call it, based in the wetlands of Kerala, based in the tiger reserves of Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, and in the eastern Himalayas. Now there, when the presence is location-based, place-based, NCF has many such locations, where you're based in a geography for about 20 years and you're collecting longitudinal data. There is good quality data sitting there, which honestly needs to be analyzed. It's just data which is getting aggregated, which needs to be analyzed and applied. In many other places, I would say data follows very different ways of defining metrics to be measured, metrics to be collected, metrics of sampling, and therefore aggregating disaggregated data, which has different methodologies, does become a concern because it's very project specific. So I think it's important that certain frameworks, like, for example, the National Biodiversity Mission looked at cataloging all life in India as one important measure of bringing a certain commonality of metrics to just being able to catalog life, but addressing Samir's issue of doing it right at each village, each district level in terms of collecting that data, and then providing it back to the communities for support in their decisions around nutritional inputs, around what should they be growing, how do seasons impact, how is climate change impacting. So I think it's important to be able to go back and support some of these large initiatives, which are oriented towards providing frameworks and a certain commonality of data set approaches, but all collection is localized and locally adapted to the requirements on the ground. So some amount of mainstreaming, as Samir said, can happen through good quality localized inputs that are then converted into archetypes that can be used across locations. But I also wanted to go back to your point on policy and maybe look at it from the lens of, say, carbon sequestration. And let's go back to the whole issue of climate mitigation and carbon sequestration and look at policy. And I'm going specifically to nature-based solutions again. Soil carbon and carbon above soil through natural solutions is a huge aspect of carbon sequestration potential that India has. We go back to the point that Samir made around, soil quality, and almost 30 to 35% of agricultural lands in India are degraded. Soil quality is extremely degraded. That not only has an impact in terms of all that we spoke about on nutritional security, livelihoods, pressure on income diversification, and biodiversity loss, but it also has an impact in terms of our goals around carbon sequestration. Because just to give you an example, of grasslands, for example, almost 130 to 140 metric tons of carbon per hectare is below ground. One doesn't even think of that carbon below ground as potential sequestration to be preserved and kept intact. All grasslands are classified as wastelands in India under the Wasteland Atlas, and therefore are open to any kind of change of use. So how do we influence policy to look at specific ecosystems like grasslands, possibly from the lens of carbon sequestration first to start with, because that might be easier to support policy decisions, but it in turn impacts communities that are dependent on those grasslands, and it impacts biodiversity that exists in those grasslands. So this is just one example of how we could use this data to work with policy from an angle that policy is comfortable approaching the problem first. But because of the interconnectedness, it really supports human well-being and biodiversity, even as it looks at climate-related goals.
Thanks. And I think this very specific example, right, both the one on with farmers and on nature-based solutions, I think it also speaks to what is a particular Indian form of leadership. And Shloka, I want to throw this question to you. So let's go back up to the 30,000 foot level, right? How India shows up on with respect to climate leadership globally matters, because agendas can be pushed on us, and we can push agendas on the world. We've seen, there is an agenda around decarbonization, which is great, but that has to come hand in hand, as India has been saying, with other things, such as actually reducing consumption, which is not a conversation other countries are necessarily interested in. There's also a conversation around climate justice, especially for other countries not as large as India. So climate leadership becomes important. I think philanthropy, again, I have seen plays a really strong role in leadership, because running around with flexible capital allows you to get into a conversation very quickly. I've seen this at all of the COPs. Yeah. You have gigantic piles of capital, but the people who are moving things around are often foundations, individual billionaires, just because they can very quickly say, great, I'll put $10 million behind this idea, something that governments would take years to make happen. And so this is, again, something that I know your organization thinks about. How do you think about Indian leadership at a global level? What needs to be unique about it? And are we showing up well? Is there a role for philanthropy?
Thank you. I think you've put it exceptionally well in terms of articulating sort of that gap at the global level as well. And I think what we've realized is that there is a deep need for a narrative that actually reflects the Global South's aspirations for development and their need to combat, of course, the climate crisis. And I think it applies to both climate and development narratives. I think Anita and Samir have actually touched on this quite deeply in the conversation, but you really have to think about this equity lens that needs to be reflected in the climate conversation. You have very sort of important needs in terms of a developing country that is facing significant difficulties and rapidly transitioning away from fossil fuels, and yet making space for very sensitive discussions around energy security and access, economic and socioeconomic growth, climate vulnerabilities. We can no longer focus on either climate or development in these narratives. That's a binary that we just have to do away with. And we have to move to a climate integrated development narrative for the future. I keep saying this, there is no critical pathway to sustainable development that is innocent of climate anymore. And that means that in order to really build out that narrative, or to speak to those sort of conjoined needs of climate and development, you have to make sure that the developing world really participates quite deeply and leads in terms of what a sustainable future should look like. Because we have the most to lose and gain now. India, for instance, is leading its 1.4 billion population to sustainable development while setting really strong net zero goals. That's a journey very few nations have taken. And we're shaping a climate integrated development narrative that, additionally will resonate with many countries. So when you talk about leadership, that's really the space that we uniquely hold right now. And I think we have an opportunity, as I said, to really shape that global narrative. One more thing, just on the point around equity, I do really believe that, there is sort of a very important conversation that we need to have around that, not just globally, but of course within India. And that's a conversation that, again, philanthropy has to hold. Our solutions today and our continued development trajectory has to be as inclusive as possible. And again, this is something I know, for instance, Samir really believes quite deeply, Anita, you as well. You cannot aggravate existing challenges and underserved populations. So to give you an example, our workforce right now is particularly vulnerable to climate risks. Today, you have 380 million people in India who are dependent on heat-exposed labor. And that actually their work contributes to nearly half the country's GDP. And at the same time, India might be one of the first countries in the world to actually break the human survivability limit. So sectors and populations that contribute a lot to the GDP are also some of the most vulnerable to climate risks. So they have to be provided that capacity and tools to adapt, to build resilience to climate change. And that's really a very sort of profound conversation around what equity means. You have to respond to the climate crisis and yet secure socioeconomic growth while not leaving anyone behind. And that's why the conversation around an intersectional focus, not sort of siloing it within particular sectors, is really important. The other thing I say consistently is climate is not a sector. It is a lens that you apply to all of the development work that we're undertaking right now. And that just has to be repeated across, of course, the country. And as I said, again, at a global level. And that is really the opportunity and the role for philanthropic leadership.
Yeah, it's really well put. I mean, I've spent a lot of my time working on girl education. And and when you talk about girls' education, it's always about patriarchy and thinking about changing attitudes. Over the last 2-3 years, I'm seeing enough evidence that girls are missing out more on school, not because of patriarchy, but because of climate. There'll be more days of school lost because it's too hot than because of the attitudes. Not to say that those attitudes still don't need to change, but it's incredible. Like, we are compounding many of those things. And so I think the equity piece is extremely strong. I'm going to ask everyone to talk a little bit about, if magic wand, something they feel really needed to be funded, but also ask the audience to put some questions into the Q&A if we can sneak in a few questions as well, because I think this will be the last round of questions. Otherwise, I'm happy to keep asking. But before I do that, Shloka, maybe back to you, just as we are talking about what are the things we can fund, and again, having an audience that's sitting, some of them at least, outside of India, right? Giving to climate is itself challenging, right? And Anita talked a bit about policy layers. I mean, the policies in India and outside funding coming in to think about how to influence policy. It's a very traditional area for philanthropy, is to push governments to be bolder. And yet that's not an easy space in India at the moment, or is it, right? Can you speak a bit about how outsiders can engage at the political or the policy level? And then I'm going to turn to Anita and Samir to talk a bit about things they feel would be great to fund that are being overlooked.
Great question again. You're full of great questions today, Gaurav. I think, in all honesty, when you talk about, when I started the conversation right at the top of the hour, basically I referred to sort of this big gap when it came to climate finance and how critical that was to sort of fill. I think we don't talk enough about how, we also need to think about relevant finance. and where that money is going. It's not just the quantity that's important, it's the quality of that money, in terms of both sort of the source of capital, i.e. why is philanthropic capital so important? Because it's the most flexible, patient, unrestricted, and also where it's going. And a major gap right now, and this relates to the policy question, is the fact that we don't have enough reliable data and evidence to actually inform where finance has to flow. So this is a big challenge, in the climate sort of, fund, across climate funding, globally, but specifically in India as well. Data and evidence are critical, and they can tell us where the finance gaps are. They will tell us how strategically and effectively we can use available finance. And you can use that data and evidence to inform a diverse set of strategies, right? Like, what sort of effective or low emission technologies do we need to invest in? What are the innovations we need to take to scale? What are the policies that need to be built out in order to, ensure that those markets can, work effectively, or in some cases be built in certain sectors where markets don't even exist? How do you better prepare for and respond to climate risks and extreme weather events? How do we account for loss and damage? This is just a whole set of data infrastructure that doesn't exist right now in India. And so one example, just maybe to bring it into sort of a little more clarity, is that we need a clear assessment of climate vulnerabilities and risks that countries are facing, because that can truly tell us where green investments have to flow. So one thing that we're doing at the ICC is we're supporting the development of a climate risk atlas to map climate vulnerabilities at the district and sub-district levels across India. This is a piece of work that the Council on Energy, Environment and Water is leading on. CSE, the Center for Science and Environment, recently did a very critical assessment of extreme weather events in India, and that's another example of really crucial data. And again, reliable data like this will inform adaptation and resilience strategies and feed into policy. It will tell us how severe our climate risks are and the urgency with which we need to act. So it tells you, or rather shows you, the needs of different regions and communities. It can form the base for how we contextualize strategies to geographies. How do you build disaster preparedness? How do you factor in response? How do you look at loss and damage compensation, for example, or for more sustainable infrastructure to build resilience to these climate risks? So all of those are sort of missing gaps right now. But again, this is where we see a really critical role for philanthropic investment, and it's going to feed into sort of where policies need to be built at the national level as well. One last point, and I know I'm sort of stretching my time here, but I do think it's an important one at the policy level because you brought this up specifically, is the need, or rather the fact that there is a tremendous gap of subnational action right now in India. We do need to promote that. And what's happening is we are setting explicit climate targets at the national level, and they're usually mitigation policies. But states in India tend to focus more on adaptation policies under the state action plans for climate change. And we need to synergize, both those sort of sets of policy pieces or action. And we have to see how we can raise the climate ambition of subnational actors, whether it's at the city or state level. How do we make sure that they're potentially contributing to those emission reductions, so that, as I said, they're helping implement national climate policies at the ground level, and you have to push forward a really collaborative agenda for climate action around that as well. That's again another place where we see a very strong role for philanthropic funding and action.
Yeah, so big takeaway is outside funders can always play a very strong sort of apolitical role by just getting the information gap, higher quality information that allows local organizations to act. Now we're almost out of time, so Anita, Samir, just very quickly, if you can just highlight a few, magic wand, here's one thing that I think is really important that philanthropic capital is ignoring, government capital is ignoring, private capital is ignoring. Be great to hear, nice little plug, right, on something that you feel is just being ignored. Maybe Anita, we'll start with you.
Yeah, Gaurav, I think we have limited time, so very quickly, I just go back to what I was speaking about earlier, which is the whole issue of land use change and land-based emissions. We're just not looking at the whole aspect of land-based emissions seriously enough. And arising out of that, I think specific focus area would be around restoration. Restoration from all lenses, whether it's production landscapes, which is agriculture, or whether it is natural landscapes, be it forests, grasslands, wetlands. There is a huge need to focus on restoration projects combined with alternative livelihoods, livelihood diversification. And I think this intersection is a very important area where philanthropic capital could go seriously and make a significant difference in terms of not just the area of degraded lands to be addressed, but also their carbon sequestration potential and consequent impact on desertification and degradation.
Fantastic. And I know that Atri is actually a great organization to reach out to for anyone who wants to know more about that. Samir?
Yeah, so I'm going to go a little meta on this. We believe that one huge gap in how problem solving is happening today is that everything comes pre-bundled. Funding, solutions, and pre-selected geographies come pre-bundled into a pilot, and it never hits. It never becomes part of an ecosystem that's available to everybody else to pull solutions from to make change wherever they are. So there are thousands of change makers, hundreds of thousands of change makers out there who are willing to experiment, people who are willing to be entrepreneurial, put in their own money into little experiments, which all go towards biodiversity, sustainability, etc. If we can think of problem solving as ecosystem creation versus doing specific programs or projects or pilots, come together to fund large an ecosystem of solutions, as it were, that's available out there with evidence, with help available, right? Because where it's crazy how difficult it is to find one person to train somebody on backyard poultry today in this country, after dozens of programs on that everywhere, right? Because you can fire up an AWS server in the next 5 minutes, but you can't actually solve a problem in a village because the help is just not available. If we start funding ecosystem backbones of all sorts around millets, around natural farming, around energy access, around livelihoods, and so on and so forth, and it's available solutions out there, I think we will do all of us a huge favor in trying to mainstream it.
And that kind of requires philanthropy to also be a lot more flexible than it sometimes has been coming to the table, right? I think
yes, because attribution is a longer game. Non-linear impact is the one you're chasing there, not small buckets of impact that you can report this quarter or this year.
So in some ways, it's the opposite of what I just asked. If people listening, if you want to give, don't start out by, here's my pet project, and really think about how you're helping the ecosystem where there's lots of experts who know what they're doing. I'm going to sneak in one audience question. I've been allowed a little bit of time because it's a great question, which we sort of started to address, which is the transition that India needs to make on agriculture. You had the first green revolution, and it was done for the right reasons, but you're now stuck with, a few crops, less diversification and so forth. What are the steps, given we know we need to move away? Like, what's that first step that gets us to even move away? And there's so much invested and sunk capital and, vested interests sitting there. Any quick thoughts on the role that philanthropy can play to just get us moving into a direction that actually people have been talking about for decades? It's not a new conversation. It still hasn't happened. These are energy and water intensive crops that we're stuck with and low nutrition in many ways. And that's for anybody who wants to jump in. Samir, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll go back to the point I made earlier. I mean, the green revolution happened because of a large ecosystem that almost made it happen. Can we create an ecosystem for the other outcomes that we're chasing? Can we create? People are willing to experiment. People are willing to put in their money, time, effort. The average farmer out there spends a really large amount of money in experimenting with whatever they can lay their hands on. Can we create this large ecosystem of expertise, help available, financing, de-risking of experimentation, more diverse? Your procurement chain needs to support biodiversity. It's very focused on 2 commodities at a time right now, and so on and so forth. So if you're able to help create an ecosystem that allows people to experiment, I don't think we have to force the experiments on them. I think a forest of ideas will take over, and we will evolve into a better place.
Perfect. Let's leave it there, just in the interest of time. I'll just do a quick summary where at least what I heard is we need decentralized scale on this in India. Like, I think it's both achieving that localization and decentralization while getting those things to scale. And I think, that takes a strong ecosystem approach. Part of that ecosystem is quality information. Again, local information. There's a lot of institutions that could do with the kind of money that's foresighted to be funding that kind of research. And that's what then gets you to good policy changes. But to do that, we need people like Shloka to get a lot of Indian leadership having the conversation at all levels. Otherwise, climate solutions are going to be thrust upon us as opposed to really ground up. So really phenomenal conversation. Thanks everyone for your time, and to Indiaspora and the GIVE team for inviting us. I'll turn it back to them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gaurav, Shloka, Anita, and Samir. This was a very insightful conversation. Thank you so much for summarizing it for people like us, Gaurav, that are new to the climate space, and it's a lot sometimes to take in. But really appreciate all of you taking the time to come to our summit, sharing all of your amazing knowledge. Thank you, GIVE, for hosting the panel. And before I sign off, Gaurav, I want to take a moment to say congratulations on the birth of your baby boy. I think it's a moment that needs to be celebrated by everyone. Congratulations, and thank you so much for making it, even though you're probably sleep deprived and very tired. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. I'm even more committed to the future as a result of the last.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. I'll move on to the next segment. I'm going to call on my colleague, Mansi Dharne, who is the Director of Development for Indiaspora. She is going to introduce our next very young but very amazing speaker. Take it over, Mansi.
Thank you, Amita. And it's just been fascinating listening to everybody. It's just very inspirational and, impactful work that our speakers here are sharing with all our audience members. So thank you so much for, being part of it. And I just want to move on with a little quote that, I from the bio that I read for our next speaker. And she says, when we as citizens come together, miracles can happen. And I feel that's a very thought-provoking idea shared by our next speaker, Prachi Shivgaonkar. And welcome, Prachi. I hope you're having a wonderful morning. If you're in Mumbai, Pune, Pune, India. I'm Bombay, so I kind of mix the two. But, welcome. And Prachi is a highly accomplished climate entrepreneur and a founder of Cool the Globe. Cool the Globe, it's an app for climate action with users from over 110 countries. Prachi has been awarded by the Finance Minister of India as the Young Changemaker of the Year. Congratulations, Prachi. She's also the first Indian citizen to be appointed on the advisor board of climate leadership. And this was alongside the former Prime Minister of Finland. It's an amazing accomplishment you've had, Prachi, and at such a young age. And fun fact that I read about you is you managed to convince your Desi parents to take a year of a gap in between studies. So that's very interesting to read. With that, take it over, Prachi, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Mansi, for that wonderful introduction. And I have to tell you, I've learned so much in just this past hour from all of you. I know we have a lot of remarkable people here today on the panels and in the audience, and it makes me very happy to be here. Often people ask me about how we built Cool the Globe and how we grew this citizen-led app for climate action. But when Amita called me for this event today, she asked me a different question. She asked me why I do what I do. And so today I want to tell all of you about a prequel to our journey, into why I decided to start working on climate change in the first place. So I remember when I was in 4th standard, my school teacher gave us a very interesting homework. She asked us to write a letter to our future selves. 10 years from now, where would I want to be and who would I want to be? So I wrote that letter and then completely forgot about it. Now, 10 years later, I was at a very decisive point. I had just passed my board exams and I had to decide which field am I going to choose. And that time, something interesting happened. My school teacher sent those letters back to us. And reading it was like a huge wake-up call for me. Because in it, my younger self had written about making an impact and changing the world. And I had not thought that way in a very long time. So I kind of got inspired by the words and the dreams of my younger self. And I decided to try and build a career in which I'm making some kind of a difference. So I remember doing one day a Google search on what is the biggest problem in the world right now. And that's when climate change popped up. Now, I was very surprised to see this because all global experts were talking about how it's the most pressing issue in front of us. Nobody around me was really talking about it. So I started reading more and more about the catastrophic impacts of climate change. I read about rising sea levels, rising temperature, coastal erosion, loss of biodiversity, melting glaciers, and a lot of other scary things. And having read all of this, I asked myself a question. Do I care enough about it? Now, to be honest with you, at the time, the answer was no. To be fair, I was 18, I had enough on my plate. And even beyond all of that, I could see so many issues in front of me. And climate change seemed like this larger than life problem happening to somebody else at some other time in some other part of the world. Why would I care Arctic ice melting in some other corner of the world? So I decided to think about my part of the world. So over the next year, like Manasi told you, I convinced my parents to let me take a gap year. And I traveled across India, working with farmers, waste workers, teaching children, shadowing some social entrepreneurs who really inspired me, traveling across remote towns and villages across the country. And as I began doing that, something interesting happened. Till this point, I had only read about climate change in reports. But during this time, without intending to, I began meeting some very real voices and some very real people behind this catastrophic impacts of climate change that I had only read about till then. And they changed my entire perspective about this. And I want to tell you about two of them today. I remember meeting a 12-year-old boy at a slum not very far from my home. I was making a film on children and what their dreams look like. And I remember asking him a question. I asked him, if you get one wish and you can ask for anything in the world, what would you ask for? I would never forget his answer. He said, I would wish that my house wouldn't get filled with water again. Now, I had read that climate change was leading to extreme weather events like floods happening more frequently and more intensely. But this was the first time I realized that it can also mean that a bright young boy like him has to worry about something as basic as a shelter above his head. And this I cared about. I remember meeting another young girl. And this was when my city was seeing a drought and water was being used scarcely throughout the city. Khadakwasla Dam in Pune had dried up. And when I met her, I asked her, which standard are you in? She said, I don't go to school these days. Why is that? It was because her house got water only for 2 hours in the afternoon, and nobody else in her family could afford to stay at home. Her brothers had to go to school, so she did the job. Now, I had read about how climate change is impacting our water, is leading to droughts happening more frequently. But this was the first time I realized that this can also mean that a bright young girl like her has to quit school and stay at home to fill buckets with water. And this I cared about. I learned more about climate change from an old farmer than I would from any other global report. He said, small dwelling farmers like me can't afford to keep doing it anymore because the weather god has become angry and unreliable. And when I can't afford to grow food, there are 1,000 people behind me who can't afford to buy food. So climate change can also mean more and more people go hungry. And this I cared about. slowly, when I went on ground during that year, I started meeting so many different people. And I started realizing that climate change is not just about these big words that I had read about. As ordinary citizens, we care about very simple things. We care about our homes, we care about our food, we care about our livelihoods, and most importantly, we care about our families and the people around us. And when I realized that climate change impacts all of these things, then I asked myself, what is it then that I can do about it? Now, this was not an easy question to answer. I remember going to my father and asking him, what do you think an ordinary girl like me can do about a big problem like climate change? So we decided to start from our own homes. We took up a quest to reduce our own greenhouse gas emissions by 10% every year. So I started looking at what are the simple lifestyle changes I can make in order to do that. And I also started studying, just the way I would track the calories in my food or the calories I saved by running or doing exercise. I started looking at how can I track the avoided emissions behind my lifestyle changes. And as I began doing it, two interesting things happened. The first one was that I started to enjoy it. It felt good that at least at my own level, I was doing something. And then my friends, my relatives, neighbors, people around me began to take notice. And they would come to me and ask, how can you're doing something interesting, and we would also like to join in this quest with you. And from this idea, we came up with Cool the Globe app to help other global citizens take climate action in their own homes and reduce their personal greenhouse gas emissions to a target. I began this journey as a personal quest in my own home. And today, through grassroots, citizen-led movements, we have reached over 25 million people from around the world. Cool the Globe app now has 40,000 users from 110 countries. And all of these citizens have collectively avoided 2.5 million kg greenhouse gas emissions by taking climate actions in their own homes. And this is just the beginning. If there's anything that this journey has taught me, is that real change begins from our own homes. One climate action inspires 10 others, and it creates a ripple effect for even the larger systemic changes that we all spoke about today. Like Manasi had said that, in the beginning of this journey, I read somewhere that it's going to take a miracle to avoid the worst effects of climate change. And meeting so many citizens like me from around the world taught me that when people start taking climate action in their own homes, miracles can happen. But in order for that to happen, we need to make climate change relatable to ordinary citizens. We need to start talking about climate change in the language of what matters to us, in the language of what we are willing to fight for. So thank you so much for calling me here today. And I hope that this event is just the beginning of a long and impactful association between all of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Prachi. This was, seeing young people like you be passionate about climate, do so many amazing things, about an issue that they saw and they noticed and they felt about, gives all of us so much hope for the future. You also give me inspiration to maybe start doing something to make things better. Samir, one of our speakers, just posted in the comments saying that he's going to start cycling around town now. Thank you. So this was truly inspiration to listen to you. If I had to ask you one question, I'm going to get the app first of all, and I'm going to see what other actions I can take. But what is the one thing that someone could do that you could just tell, or maybe the top 3 things that you can tell our audience that they could do to really make a huge impact at a personal level?
Absolutely. So when I began my journey, I realized that to achieve anything at all, I first needed a clear target in front of me. And then I needed to be able to measure my progress on that target. So I realized that the important thing is to make a monthly achievable target to reduce our own carbon footprint. And that's how, we made the app as well. And then we put hundreds of simple day-to-day things that we can all do. But then I also realized that if I could not measure the impact of my actions, I could not keep myself motivated at it. So we also, started showing people the emissions that they avoided with each climate action. All of these climate actions we've categorized in the things that we can do at home, things that we can do while traveling, and the materials that we use. So there are hundreds of different things that we can all do, from recycling to traveling by low emission mode to cutting down, reducing our usage of different kinds of materials. But I think the important thing is for all of us to realize that there are many, many things we can do, and to not approach this from a place of guilt rather than approach it from a place of contentness. So I feel like real climate action sort of fulfills the other areas of our lives as well. If you want to be fitter, then you can start cycling to short distances. If you want to save money, you can start shopping less. If you want to spend time with family, you can do chores together at home instead of using appliances. So the important thing is to decide today to reduce our personal carbon footprint by 10%. Then figure out what are the actions that we can take which we could have fun with, which we would actually enjoy doing. Then start measuring the emissions that we are reducing by taking those actions, and then tell 10 other people about it. Inspire 10 other people from what you are doing in your own homes. So I would love for all of you, in fact, to join Cool the Globe app and start creating this change from our own homes.
Oh, that was so well said, Prachi. I mean, so much clarity of thought, such a great plan. I'm definitely getting the app, and I'm going to, start probably tomorrow, see what I can do about this. I love your approach that this is not about guilt. This is about, approaching it from a sense of peace and contentedness and hope for a brighter future for all of us. So thank you so much. I'll move on to the next speaker. Thank you, Prachi. But first, I'd like to call on the CEO of Indiaspora's India office, Sri Kumar Nair. He's going to go ahead and introduce the amazing keynote speaker that we have for today's session. Take it over, Sri. You're muted, Sri.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Sri Kumar, CEO for India at Indiaspora. So after some wonderful morning sessions, which were quite insightful and extremely informative, I'm delighted to introduce and welcome Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, founder, CEO for the Council of Energy, Environment and Water, the CEEW, who will be delivering the keynote address on the topic of India's position as a key player in the current international energy and climate landscape. Well, I would say icing on the cake at the end of the day. I've known him for several years, and I don't think I've met many people who is such an authority, expert, and a proponent of the climate change and anything related to it. I've been asked to introduce him in 30 seconds, which is a tall order, considering how impressive his resume is. So I'll quickly read through some of it, and the rest of it you can look in the chat box and read. So he's an internationally recognized public policy expert, author, columnist, and institutional builder. He's a founder, as I said, of the CEEW, and has led this institution to the top ranks as one of the Asia's leading policy research institutions and among the world's best 20 climate think tanks. He played a very formative role in creating the International Solar Alliance and was a founding board member of the Clean Energy Access Network, co-author, editor of 4 books, and with experience in 48 countries. He's previously worked at Princeton, Oxford, UNDP in New York, and WTO in Geneva. The Asia Society honored him recently with the 2022 Asia Game Changer Award for his and the CEW's incredible work, which is making a real difference for India and for the planet. He's also a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Clean Air and serves on the board of Climate Works Foundation. He's currently serving on Government of India's G20 Finance Track Advisory Group and advises the Sherpa track for India's G20 presidency. He advises, I don't know, many governments, industry bodies, civil society, and international organizations around the world. But mind you, ladies and gentlemen, he's not all work. In his spare time, he rides horses and plays the piano. Arunabha, that's a different conversation we'll have with you. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Arunabha Ghosh. Over to you, Arunabha.
Thank you so much, Shri, and thank you, Indiaspora, for inviting me and for a very kind introduction. Very happy to discuss horse riding. I know you're an avid cyclist, Shri, so we'll see who gets to the destination first. Talking about destinations, we know that the world as a whole has to get to something called net zero emissions by 2050. And while this seems like a very technical issue, I think the way Prachi just now distilled it down is really the way we need to move forward, bringing it down to individual action, but also bringing it down to individual agency, not to despair about this as something happening elsewhere and someone else has to fix it. It starts with us. But the us could be us as an individual, us as a community, or us as a country. And I will take the conversation forward, like if this is a relay, Prachi, I'll carry the baton forward from you and take it from the individual to what we are trying to do at a country level. So the first thing I want to talk about is, how is India positioning its own climate action vis-a-vis what's happening in the rest of the world? And then I want to talk a little bit about how is India trying to take the rest of the world along in terms of driving that climate action to a slightly different level of ambition. And finally, I want to talk to you a little bit about how is India trying to integrate climate action into the broader sustainable development paradigm that it is trying to push. So let's start with what it is trying to do at home. Just like Prachi talked a lot about the personal experiences she had in her journey. In 2010, when I wrote the concept note of CEW and then set it up a few months later in August 2010, this was just a few months after the Copenhagen climate meet that had happened in December 2009. And in many respects had been a failure. And what struck me was that the way we were approaching this problem was not the way we could actually solve it, because we were all kind of stuck in our respective, in some ways justified philosophical positions about someone else has created the problem and someone else needs to fix it and so forth. But it wasn't forward-looking enough. It wasn't looking at where are the opportunities, how will technology evolve, where will jobs come from, where will investment flow. And that was absolutely critical in what we at CEW call bringing sustainability from the margin to the mainstream. Now, if you go from 2010, when we had less than 20 megawatts of solar in the country, when at that time we had an energy policy that was looking at about 800 gigawatts of coal capacity by 2032. We've come a very long way since then, with well over 60,000 megawatts of solar capacity already, about 116,000 megawatts of what we call pure renewables, and about 167,000 megawatts of non-fossil electricity capacity. It's important to understand this because India will be the first major economy that intends to build more clean energy infrastructure within this decade than its entire electricity system as it exists today. So every hour, we have to deploy about 10.5 megawatts of renewables, 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, 52 weeks a year for the remainder of this decade. This kind of a breathless marathon that we are on, no other economy has actually gone through at this pace. But in addition to all of this is not just the renewable story, it's a bunch of many other things that are happening. Our green hydrogen mission is the world's largest, on paper at least. Now we have to, of course, deliver on it. Our electric mobility mission, I mean, there's not a formal mission, but the targets that are there of about 30% sales by 2030 and all two-wheelers, three-wheelers being electric by 2030. We at CW just launched a real-time dashboard on sales of EVs, and we see a 10x increase in sales over just the last 2 years. And this is, in Prachi's words, just the beginning. Put it all together, India is offering an investment opportunity of $550 billion in just these three sectors, renewables, mobility, and green hydrogen, this decade. We also estimate that alongside this massive investment opportunity, a potential workforce of over 1 million workers and full-time equivalent jobs of 3.5 million would be created just in renewables. The green hydrogen supply chain could create 1.9 million jobs. Electric mobility will lose jobs in the traditional automobile sector, but gain jobs otherwise. Sustainable cooling is going to create 2 million jobs in India over the next 2 decades. So there is a jobs growth and sustainability dimension to what India is putting forward. And one more thing I want to say in this regard is that it is no longer what just the central government is saying. We personally are working with at least 15 state governments. Some are developing their own net zero pathways. Some have developed their own solar policies. To give one example, Jharkhand state, which has the country's largest reserves of coal, 27% of India's coal sits in Jharkhand alone, has come out with a solar policy which will take it from 88 megawatts of solar today to 4,000 megawatts of solar by 2027. So these are not capturing headlines in the Financial Times or the Guardian, but imagine one of the world's most coal-rich provinces is putting forward a solar ambition, which is 4,100% increase in solar capacity. This is what is going on in India, whether it's natural farming in Andhra, electric mobility and battery manufacturing in Telangana. And Tamil Nadu has come out with a green climate company so that its state mission can be driven through a more efficient route. I can go state by state by state to highlight this. But then how is India taking the story to the world? And 2 examples, one on the mitigation side and one on the sort of resilience side. In 2015, India created, along with France, the International Solar Alliance. It has now 113 member countries. And what was the idea? The idea was that let's have solar where the sun shines the most. But the sun shines the most between the tropics, but renewables investment goes to, pretty gray areas where it's rainy, in the temperate regions. So how do we get capital to flow to where the sun shines the most? You can do that if you aggregate the demand, lower the costs by economies of scale, lower the cost of capital, and combine resources to invest in new solar technologies. So ISA, and as she said, I was intimately involved in its conceptualization and creation, is now aiming to crowd in about $1 trillion of investment across its member countries by the end of this decade. Similarly, a few years later, in 2019, India promoted something called the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, which is to see how does then our hard infrastructure become more resilient against these climate shocks that are coming and hitting us, and not just us, but other vulnerable countries. India alone is one of the most vulnerable economies in the world to climate change. Our estimation at CW is 3/4 of our districts are now hotspots for extreme climate events. But at the same time, we've also been cataloging, go to YouTube and search for Faces of Climate Resilience. We produced 16 short films last year, which we've even won a documentary award in the United States a few weeks ago, showcasing how communities are coming together to fight back. But it's not just community action. It needs to combine with state action, needs to combine with private investment to build resilient infrastructure. And India is trying to do that not just alone, but with other member countries. So there's an initiative called Initiative for Resilient Island States, the small island states that are literally sinking. Similarly, through ISA, it has an initiative called OSOWalk, One Sun, One World, One Grid. How do we basically have an interconnected grid so that wherever the sun is shining, we're generating solar power, and that those electrons then can flow to wherever the sun is not shining. All of this put together then brings me to the third theme. How does this fit into the broader sustainable development paradigm? And this is what India is trying to push through its G20 presidency, putting sustainability at the heart of what it means for global governance going forward. And some core themes start with exactly what Prachi talked about, changing our own lifestyles. And Mission Life that was launched at home in October last year is also being pushed as a global movement. What are our individual actions that can add up to something that is systemic in nature? So if we can change our behavior on the demand side, then we trigger on the supply side the potential of billions of dollars in the circular economy. Similarly, we need trillions of dollars to flow to the billions of people in the global south for lower cost investment in clean energy infrastructure. We also need an energy security architecture for the fuels of the future, whether it's renewables, whether it's solar panels, wind turbines, the critical minerals, or green hydrogen electrolyzers. We need to make sure that India is a critical node in resilient and interdependent supply chains for this clean energy products. And finally, we need to integrate this with the broader sustainable development agenda. We are holding the G20 presidency right at the middle of the 2015 to 2030 period. And unfortunately, the world is not progressing fast enough on the SDG agenda, not least because the pandemic combined with the debt crisis is pushing countries and people and communities back. So India is trying to put climate action, but also sustainable development and resources for it as a key driver and a key outcome of the G20. So when you put it all together and you start with that individual action, but you also internalize how much we are vulnerable and you understand how big the leap it is that we have taken over the last decade and how small that is compared to the leap we have to take over the next decade and beyond. We see that the domestic actions on the government side and the private investment side, combining with the international cooperation we are pushing, becomes a very important source of India's hard and soft power in driving people, planet, and prosperity consistent with our own aspirations. Thank you.
Thank you, Arunabha. Wonderful. I mean, that was such an insightful talk about, where India is standing today. Wonderful. Do we have any questions anywhere for Arunabha? If not, Arunabha, I have a quick question for you. As continents, I don't want to take specific countries, but as continents, which continent is the most consistent or compliant in terms of achieving their sustainability goals? And why do you think it is?
That's an interesting question, because if you look at a bulk of the developed countries, which occupy the North American continent and the European continent and the Oceanic or Australia, these were the countries that were responsible initially for the emissions reduction. The countries on the continents of Asia, South America, or Africa did not have those obligations initially when the Kyoto Protocol was operationalized. What we did at CW in the lead up to the Glasgow Climate Summit was look at who has done what. And we see that over the last 30 years, since the Rio Conventions were signed in 1992, all these countries, let's not name individual ones as you mentioned, but these countries occupying the continents of North America, Europe, and Australia had cumulatively reduced their emissions by only 3.7%, not counting for the emissions reduction from the former Soviet republics, where emissions came down because their economy is stacked. It's like how our air quality improved when the country went into lockdown. Now, an economic shutdown might be good for the planet temporarily, but is not a sustainable strategy. So if you keep them aside, then the reductions in emissions were only 3.7% against the 15-18% that was promised. If you now look at the fact that all countries have promised something or the other under what's called their nationally determined contributions, then actually the countries in the continents of Asia, South America, and Africa are also the ones that are consistent with fulfilling their goals, particularly India, which has reached its 40% non-fossil capacity target for 2030 in 2021 itself. Is that sufficient? No. And this is something that we have to now internalize. And this is the new architecture of climate action that we need to drive. That we've got to stop this, finger pointing and blame game and understand that every single month we are losing 1 percentage point of the remaining carbon space in the world that would keep us within 1.5 degrees. Now, we might think 1.5 is not bad enough. While the world has warmed at 1.1, India or South Asia has already warmed to 1.4. And with just 1.4, and I'm intentionally using just, we already see a 3x increase in cyclonic events between the 1980s and now. Much more, and as I mentioned, 3/4 of our districts hotspots for extreme climate events. So that farmer, that young boy who does not want his home flooded is not going to be just one example. As we saw in Bangalore, partly due to poor urban planning, but also partly due to unseasonal rains. It was the very rich whose homes were flooded. And climate change is that kind of a problem, which does not spare the rich or the poor. And we've got to stop thinking that the old paradigm that the rich will escape and the poor will somehow adapt does not hold anymore. Right? So it is a collective action problem. It is a wicked problem. And it's time to start seeing how we can make transformative change and yet drive investment and growth and job creation in our own countries.
Wonderful. Thank you. Amita, can I take one question? It's come up. And we'll close it. I know we are running out of time.
Dr. Ghosh, do you have a minute?
Quickly.
Maybe a couple more minutes, yeah.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So the question is, India is on a tier building highways while good roads reduces commute times and saves burning of carbon. However, the concrete roads themselves are sources of global warming. What are your thoughts about balancing this?
The 3 words, life cycle analysis, right? Whatever it is that we do, we'll have to look at the entire life cycle of what it is our footprint is, which includes whether it's a concrete road or a tarred road, or whether it's an electric vehicle. And this goes back to lifestyles. We celebrate it. I don't want to come across as if I'm taking a pot shot at a particular company. But the point is, when Tesla introduced its electric SUV, it came across as, social media was buzzed with how cool it is. But no one was asking, why does an urban dweller need an SUV? Now, we did at CW the country's largest survey on urban mobility. What is the primary mode of travel for more than 60% of Indians? They're 2 legs. That is the primary mode of travel for more than 60% of urban Indians, not counting poor rural Indians. Okay. So while there is sustainability, there is also a time value of money. There is a question of, the health costs, etc. So we've got to absolutely, that's the question I was asked, we have to balance all of this out. But we have to balance it in terms of when you take mobility, the first thing has to be, how do you design cities where you reduce the mobility need itself? Mobility is a service. So if I can design cities in a more compact way that my mobility need itself is reduced, then regardless of whether I'm driving a petrol car or in a diesel bus or an electric SUV, that is not needed. Second is the mode shifting. So how do we move more and more towards electric public transport? I'll give you an example. My own colleagues in our mobility team have helped the city of Kochi design a program to convert more than 32,000 auto rickshaws into e-autos. India did the world's largest single tender of e-buses last year, 5,000, and this year the tender will be for 50,000 e-buses. So this shift from reducing the mobility need, then moving towards public transport, and then switching the transport itself to non-liquid hydrocarbons. That is the avoid, shift, and transform approach we need in mobility. And in doing all of that, whether it's mobility, whether it's cooling, whether it's solar panels, we of course have to look at the life cycle emissions. Because ultimately, we've got to recognize that carbon itself is not a bad thing. Without carbon, you and I wouldn't exist. Carbon in the wrong place, which is concentrations of it in the atmosphere, is what is wrong. So we can create a circular economy of carbon, circular economy of water, circular economy of soil, circular economy of plastics, circular economy of minerals. Then we actually create new business opportunities, new technologies, right? But also are conscious in our consumption to drive sustainable production.
Wonderful. You were terrific, Arunabha. Thank you so much. And that brings us to a close of this. I would like to thank everyone who joined this summit today. All the sessions were insightful, very productive. I would like to thank all the speakers, Arunabha, Veena, Arun, Gaurav, Samir, Anita, Shloka, Prachi, everyone. Thank you so much. And I sincerely hope that the audience also found this summit very productive. We're going to end the session with a music video that's a tribute to our precious resource, water. It has been created by one of our Indiaspora friends, Kanika Kanikeshwaran. Please, can it be played? Thank you. Sorry, there is no sound. You might have to.
Let me try that again.
Yeah, please do.
Sarvai வானின்றுலகம் வழங்கி வருதலால் தான் அமிர்தம் என்றுணர பாற்று. வானின்றுலகம் வழங்கி வருதலால் தான் அமிர்தம் என்றுணர பாற்று. அமிர்தம் என்றுணர பாற்று. அமிர்தம் என்றுணர பாற்று.
Thank you, everyone. Once again, thank you so much for being with us during this wonderful session. Thank you, team Indiaspora. Have a lovely day, all of you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye. Thank you, Arunabha, again, as he left. Okay, bye.